And bago magsimula ay si Miss Yalung ay siya mangunguna para sa ating panalangin. Kasi tayo muna po tayo.
Panginoon, salamat po at pinagdala niyo po kami sa natural na ito, na may ang aming matutunan sa araw nito ay may bahagi namin sa iba at maging ang bunga po ang pagpupulong namin sa araw na ito. Ito po ang pinsang matalamin sa lahat sa Panginoon Jesus. Amen. Sa ngalan ng Ama, ng Anak, ng Espiritu Santo. Amen.
Maraming salamat, Miss Yalung. Magsiupo na po tayo. Gaya po ng format nung ating nakaraan na panayam kay Dr. Ileto, ay magsisimula po tayo sa presentasyon ng aklat niya na Knowledge and Pacification. Magpe-present po ay si Mr. Fabio Paspanyo, ating pong estudyante sa MA. Bago po ang lahat ay nais po namin batiin na magandang umaga rin si Ma'am Jelma Cruz Araneta. Dito po siya para makinig. So, Mr. Paspanyo, pwede bang simulan mo na ang presentasyon?
Yes,
magandang umaga sa inyong lahat. Ako po si Fabio. At ang libro ni Dr. Ileto na Knowledge of Pacification ay actually isa sa mga ngayon mga binasa. And sa pagbasa ko, ito ay nakakabulat actually sa mga mata ng bilang isang Pilipino. Yung bago ko siya basahin actually, naganap ako ng mga review articles nito. Tinignan ko kung paano nila perceive ang libro ko na. And ayun, to be honest, I find the book really engaging as a student of history. And sa pagbasa ko, ay dito sa PowerPoint na ito, naglagay ako ng parang 4 points regarding dun sa key points ng libro. Simula, actually, yung pinaka-interesting dito ay okay. Sa pagbasa ko nito, ang main points na nakita ko, una, it actually discusses the forgotten past ng ating bansa. And it actually shows the different atrocious events na parang kinalimutan ng ating mga ninuno. So, sa pag... And then, bukod din doon, meron din tayo talaga forgotten friendship. Based doon sa solong libro, makikita natin doon kung paano ang discussion natin towards relationship with Japan, with the United States, nag-iba. Ano? Ang isa sa mga interesting sa libro actually ay ang paggamit ng awit sa pagsulat ng kasaysayan. Ang history is presented using different awits actually. Sobrang nakalaan doon ang mga awit na nagre-reflect ng muna nationalism, pride and glory ng mga Pilipino noon. And huli is politics and society. Sa libro, nag-discuss doon ang concept ng loob na pinapakita kung paano tayong mga Pilipino ay kumpara dun sa mga Amerikano, may concept ng loob. Okay. Sunod ang dictation ng principales. Dito nagpo-fall ang tinatawag na cacique democracy. Kung paano ang democracy na pinakita dito ay nadidictate lamang ng mga rural elite, kumbaga sabi sa ito. And dito rin makikita natin the masses versus the elite kung paano ang role ng mga role ng mga masses sa revolution compared dun sa role ng mga elite sa revolution. Okay. And lastly, of course, ang role ng religion. Ang interesting side nito sa libro na religion was actually used in a form of nationalistic manner sa discussion after. Na for the revolutionaries to actually embody the revolution, they used religion as a stream of embodying revolution. And last, of course, is the return of Bonifacio. This was an interesting case for me because at first I was really thinking of how would Bonifacio return. And doon pinakita ko yung characteristics lahat ni Bonifacio regarding sa leadership, sa nationalism niya, sa Pilipino. And actually, doon na nag-end yung presentation ko sa discussion ng libro. I finished the book with reading and everything, and ito yung mga points na nakuha ko. Thank you.
Drag natin yung paikul sa likod. Kagaya kahapon. Hindi set up namin kahapon.
Okay, wait.
Hindi ka pumunta.
Ganda ng windbreaker. Ano na ba yun?
Hindi.
Di ba yung windbreaker?
Hindi.
Semi.
Ano ba? Yung sa sinig ko.
Yung double ano,
Yung nawawala ka.
Saan?
Diba, egg?
1.9 something.
190. Maganda siya. Ano naman yung pagkakas?
Kaso,
Technician requested white hair.
sa family, sa bahay, pakalat ka lang.
File Explorer.
Same ko mo.
Yeah. Okay. Lalabas yan.
Hindi. Kaya Siyempre, president. Kayo po,
Okay.
Good morning, everybody. I want to welcome our special guest, Gemma, who's I did not expect here. But thank you for coming. I did not prepare. I did not prepare a PowerPoint for this presentation except to put the chapter headings of my book here, and I will just comment on them. But I hope that you will ask me questions later on about the book. I assume that because this was assigned to the class that you have seen the book, even if you may not have finished reading it. This book, let me start now. So this book was actually approved by the Ateneo Press in 2006. I started to put it together after the 9/11, after what happened in New York, and during the lead up to the invasion of Iraq. And by 2005 or 4, I submitted the proposal with the draft, and Ateneo approved it, and it was forthcoming from 2007 on, but it only actually came out in 2017. There's a story behind that, but I will leave it to later time for me to write down the attempts basically by some people to prevent me from saying certain things, especially about the United States and the Philippines. So it was published in 2017, and it has not been reviewed in any academic journal. Although I think it's about to be reviewed soon, but I had to encourage some journal editors to please do something about it. It's actually a scandalous situation. in my previous book, Filipinos in the Revolution won the National Book Prize, and of course the Special Revolution. But how come this book is being ignored by certain people? Well, certain people, because in fact, the first printing ran out, and so the second printing was made available just this month. It was launched. So there are some people reading the book. The book is in 3 parts. The Philippine-American War is the first part. The second part is memory, history, politics, and the third part is knowledge and pacification. So it's not a continuous narrative. In fact, the real narrative part of the book is part 1, the Philippine-American War. But all the parts are interconnected in a way, but you have to read the whole and maybe reflect a bit on what the connections are between the 3 parts. So let me go through the table of contents. Because the summary we had earlier only touched upon certain aspects of the book. I would like to help you to see the book as a whole. Okay, so the first part is the Philippine-American War, and the first chapter 1 is the introduction. Actually, it's called A Shared History of Wars. And you see, I start with the present. I start with an analysis of the speech of President George Bush when he came to the Philippines in October 2003, just before the invasion of Iraq. He was trying to get the Philippine government to join the coalition of the willing by the willing. And of course, President Arroyo was only too willing to join. But in the speech that he gave, that he delivered at Congress, he made a lot of references to history, and he emphasized the fact that the Philippines and the United States have a shared history. And so what I've done is to reconstruct his speech and to show that there is one thing that is, there's a glaring absence in the speech. There is no reference to the Philippine-American War. So in trying to encourage Filipinos to think about a shared history between the U.S. and the Philippines, it's almost a requirement that we must forget the Philippine-American War. It doesn't help to enhance the shared history. It actually disrupts it. It subverts the shared history. Of course, what he was doing, what Bush was doing, was to try to encourage the Filipino participation in the Iraq War as a joint venture. Filipinos joining with the Americans to fight Saddam and bring democracy and all those things. Harking back to a similar time when Filipinos and Americans fought together, and that was against the Japanese. So the Filipino-American war against the Japanese is one of those events that I try to put in a different context by comparing the Filipino-Japanese war to the Philippine-American War, and suggesting, or asserting actually, that those two wars are actually comparable, and you cannot remember, we Filipinos should not remember one and forget the other. We should remember both because both were terrible, and it might even be possible to prove that the Philippine-American War was a far more terrible event than the war against Japan. But how did this happen? How did we come to a situation where the President of the United States, and this is actually a feature of almost all of their discourse when it comes to trying to establish, or trying to advantage of the special relationship with the Philippines to mount a war. Of course, now it's against China, but there is always a reference to the joint the joint effort made by Filipino and American forces to liberate the Philippines and to resist the Japanese and liberate the Philippines from Japan. So there's it's actually a case of forgetting one war and remembering another war. And in a way, the book is all about trying to make us rethink this situation, especially now that we are in a similar situation to what we faced before World War II. And yeah. So the first chapter sets the, in the first chapter, this introduction, I start with the present, and then I say I'm going to go back in history, and then I'm going to return to the present at the end. So it's present, past, and then back to the present towards the end of the book. Oh, here's a slide which is not in the book, but I used this for one of my courses. I thought I'd show it to you. This is the speech of Bush, and there is President Gloria Bush. The irony of this, of course, is that the downfall of Gloria Arroyo would be, to a great extent, caused by her attempt to become closer to China. And as soon as she did certain things to establish a closer relationship with China, certain corruption charges came out, and a lot of the anti-Arroyo controversies began to heat up soon after she showed that she wanted to have a special relationship with the People's Republic of China. So there are also there are parallels between that time, the recent time, and the present. So you can see here that Bush talks about the fact that America is proud of its part in the great story of the Filipino people. Together, our soldiers liberated the Philippines from colonial rule. He mentions two instances in which the Americans helped the Filipinos liberate themselves from colonial rule. First, the coming of Americans in 1898 as allies with Reynaldo to help liberate the Philippines from Spain. And that was when General Arthur MacArthur came. And the second, of course, is the joint struggle against the Japanese invaders in the early 1940s, and the coming of General Douglas MacArthur as the second MacArthur to help in the liberation of the Philippines. So there is no mention whatsoever of the fact that the alliance between Reynaldo and the U.S. broke up when the Americans decided to occupy the Philippines and take it, and turn the Philippines into its colony. Apparently, during this speech, there were a few lawmakers who did not agree and did not clap, but the vast majority gave Bush a standing ovation, which shows that their view of Philippine history is rather shallow. So in chapter 2, I go back to the Philippine-American War, but then I write about the Philippine-American War in a different way. My account of my case study is actually based on Western Payatas province, or Western Quezon province, a few towns there. But there is actually an academic dimension to this. I'm writing about the war to provide a different approach to what Glenn May did in his book, Battle of Batangas. I have not been able to write a sequel to Battle of Batangas, but I am actually ready to write a different book on the Battle of Batangas, and I will not call it the Battle of Batangas, but it will be my reply to Ben May. It's very good, it's very useful to have another scholar who has such different views, because it then helps you to define your own position. So this is actually, although I don't think I mentioned it directly, an example of how to treat the Philippine-American War in a very different way from how Ben May and most American scholars treat it, including some Filipino scholars, by the way. It's also different from the way that Mila Guerrero treats the Philippine-American War in her book thesis, because in my view she was already influenced by her American professors when she went to Michigan. So maybe it's not a criticism. It's just that she internalized the perspective, which is valid, but there are others. It's not. Yeah, I'll show you eventually why I find that approach problematic. You will see here that in this chapter I bring out certain characters like Norberto Mayo, who is an example of an educated man, a graduate of University of Santo Tomas, Spanish-speaking, mestizo. He was the commander of one of the regiments in Yalung. And then, side by side, he fought against the Americans together with Ladislao Masangkay, another type of leader who was not Spanish speaking. Yeah. Oh yeah. Up and down, right? Okay, can you hear me better? Yeah, the other one, I think this sounds like Donald Trump. Sorry. But yeah, I felt something was strange that my voice was not me. Going back to those two characters, just like my earlier work on Dato Uto or Apolinario de la Cruz, Sakai, I bring out certain characters and trying to give future filmmakers ideas about how to write, how to produce different kinds of movies about the Philippine-American War, so that we can have an antidote to the usual kinds of movies that we have seen recently with Enrique and Goyo. Norberto Mayo is an example of the militar ilustrado, and Ladislao Masangkay, who was not Spanish speaking, although he could converse with the fraile, of course, but he was an ex-mayor. He was a bit, he was dark. He was not mestizohin. He could speak Spanish, but very funny Spanish. But he was a very effective military leader. He was a good mayor of Yalung. So that's one type, and I think you could find contemporary examples of the ex-mayor who becomes a commander. And Mayo is a typical educated Filipino who also becomes a commander. So how do those two leaders deal with their soldiers? How did they manage to mobilize them? So I talk about the guerrilla regiments at Yalung because I want to provide an example of what can be done to hundreds of other towns. Or not that, hundreds, maybe dozens, but no. I think it's safe to say that we could come up with a lot more instances where the towns people were mobilized to resist the Americans, but we don't know. anything about them. In fact, nobody has written about Mayo and Masangkay except me. Just like when I rediscovered Tato Uto, nobody had written about him. So Philippine history, there's a lot that can be done if we just plunge into the sources and be committed to retrieving or resurrecting more of these figures from history. But there's a reason why we don't know much about people like Mayo Masangkay and the Chaong regiments and all of those, the 100 other regiments of troops that fought the Americans, is because during the American colonial regime we were not encouraged to remember them, or we were discouraged from remembering them because they might, give Filipinos a negative image of the Americans. So, now in the following chapter, it's a very different chapter, and it was mentioned earlier in the summary. This technology here is very. I think you should buy Lenovo next time instead of Acer. Okay. No, okay. I got it. Chapter 3 is a very different chapter. Because in chapter 2, in reading the documents about the Chaong regiments, I kept on coming up with statements saying that the people from the barrios were more committed to fighting the Americans than the people in the Poblacion. In other words, there was a popular movement against the American occupiers. But of course, we are made to think that it's only the well-to-do, the Illustrados who were against the Americans and the masses were not. But in fact, it was a popular resistance to the Americans. And so, how do you understand the nature of this popular resistance? I discovered that those guerrilla officers were useless unless they could speak to their soldiers in Tagalog in a way that that boosted their morale. So at the beginning, there were well-to-do officers who, because they had money and titles and connections, they became colonels. But after the initial American onslaught, they discovered they could not keep the troops together. But the more effective ones were able to. So, and the more effective officers were not necessarily from the masses like Bonifacio Tat. They could also be Spanish-speaking, educated, mestizo ones, but it had something to do with their commitment to the struggle and also their ability to speak well, to declaim, and to use the right images, the right discourse. In other words, they were, I call them rural Ilustrados. We have a very narrow view of Ilustrados. We always associate them with, Rizal types, the highly educated ones. But in the rural area, there were people who knew Spanish or read Spanish, but they also read Tagalog, Awit, Comedia, and spoke, and were closely aligned with the thinking of the so-called masses, the Taong Bayan. Now this Awit is about the Philippine-American War, but it locates the struggle within a religious discourse. So this is a continuation of my Passion Revolution type of research. But it is meant to bring out the religious dimension of the resistance to the Americans. Again, nobody had heard of this Awit before. I found it by accident in the archives or in the Philippine Insurgent Records, revolutionary papers. And I thought it would be a good illustration of how to understand why, the lower classes actually were able to meaningfully participate in the resistance to the Americans under officials who were landowners, who were even ilustrators, provided these leaders knew how to communicate with those below. And this would be an example of that, because this was actually written by a rural illustrator. This awit of the Philippine-American War was not written by a peasant. The person who wrote it knew Philippine history, had read Rizal, obviously, but also was a religious person probably. Maybe he was a member of one of the religious groups among Banahaw, we don't know. It's anonymous. But what he writes in this awit is not very different from the manifestos that General Malvar put out when he was trying to keep the morale of his troops up. You know, General Malvar wrote in this manner. And so did Reynaldo. We forget that. But Luna was incapable of doing this. He was a real illustrator. I've never seen a speech of his in the vernacular to the common soldier. Now, in chapter 4, I talk about the Filipino-American War in the rural setting, and the focus is on the mayor. Very important, because the mayor was the key to the continuing resistance. And in this case, the mayor, Pedro Cantos, was playing a game called Amigo Warfare, being loyal to the Americans by day and helping the guerrillas by night. And so I bring up several characters. Pedro Cantos and Inspector Herrera is a constabulary officer assigned to the region. He also comes from that region, but he was playing a similar game. He was helping the guerrillas secretly. So this is a topic that deserves more study, because it shows that Filipinos can actually surrender or can collaborate with the Americans, and yet behind the scenes, or without Americans knowing, they can engage in very different activities. So I bring out what I hope is a new event in Philippine history, the Battle of Candelaria. I've never heard of the Battle of Candelaria, of course not. But there were so many events like that, because Malvar, up to late 1901, he made it a policy for the Filipino guerrillas to mount attacks on the American garrisons at certain times of the year. And so that's what Colonel Masangkay and Colonel Maya did. They attacked the American garrison in Candelaria. And so I have an account of what happened. But in this story, you have a very interesting situation where Colonel Masangkay, being more of the Bonifacio type, led his troops in a very different way from Colonel Mayo, who was more of the Aguinaldo type. So you can see that that our images of different heroes are actually replicated in the local scene. You have Rizal type, you have Bonifacio type, you even have Luna types. The Luna types did not last very long. I have to say that. The highly educated illustrators who had no ability to deal with the ordinary troops, and also who, if anyone insulted the junior officer, he was out. He would not have lasted long. So that's why when I was watching the movie General Luna, I just was shaking my head and saying, this is not what I have learned from my archival work on the Philippine-American War in this kind of setting. This is not Central Luzon where you have two armies pitted against each other, the American army and the Philippine army. This is a guerrilla war in several towns in the southern Tagalog region. And at the end, I discussed the concentration camps in the region, which are not called concentration camps in the published records. But in the original reports of the Americans, they are called concentration camps, but the word is crossed out and replaced with protected zones. So there's a danger in using the published American War Department reports. But there have been books written solely on the basis of the published American War Department reports. No, you have to go back to the original reports filed by the American officers in order to see, for example, that they were concentration camps organized in Palawan, Santo Tomas, all of the towns practically in the southern Tagalog region. And that is where a lot of Filipinos died, especially when the cholera arrived in the region in April to May 1902. A lot of the townspeople were concentrated in the poblacion. And once the infection reaches in that situation, it spreads very quickly because everybody is, everyone is located in one small place. So the concentration camp policy actually led to more deaths from the cholera than would have been the case. And then the last section is Candelaria's trauma, where I bring out what I found in a document concerning American atrocities in Candelaria, which by now, of course, we know that the American troops committed atrocities, but we have very little detail. But there are records in the U.S. military archives, but you will not find them in the published documentation. Well, why would they publish reports of American torture? Because there was a war crimes tribunal, and everybody knows about the Japanese atrocities, but American atrocities were repressed. The fact that the American military confiscated all documents of the Filipino forces that they defeated and transported all those records to Washington and made those records unavailable for several decades meant that people doing research on the Philippine-American War did not have any documents. At least those that were confiscated by the U.S. Army because they were sent to Washington. Eventually they were returned, of course, but long after the events had taken place. So the U.S. conquest is the end of the first part, and there I deal with why Malbar surrendered, which has not been fully understood. But I first make reference to Samar because we all know about Balangiga, Samar, and I just want to make the point that Balangiga was only one of many such events all over the Philippines. But we have reduced it to Balangiga. Everyone, every time we think about the Philippine-American War, it goes the bills. But who knows what other trophies the Americans took from other parts of the Philippines, in southern Tagalog, even in Ilocos, in Leyte, northern Mindanao. The resistance to the U.S. was widespread, but my father's generation, my father was born in 1920, by the way. We have many arguments about the Philippine-American War because he didn't accept that there was such a kind of event. So this chapter discusses more about the subsistence crisis, the food crisis, and the health crisis that led Malbar to surrender. The food crisis is very clear. He said very straightforwardly that my people will die of hunger if I do not surrender, because we have to plant. We have to start planting rice because the Americans destroyed all of the rice stocks, except those that were brought to the poblacion. Of course, the reason for that is to prevent the guerrillas from getting food. In fact, when I read some of the declarations of people, why did they surrender? Most of them said, because we had nothing to eat, we had nothing to wear. And also our soldiers abandoned us because we couldn't keep them together because the situation was just so so bad, you know. People were getting sick, they were dying. And that is where the mayors come into the picture. The town mayors facilitated surrenders, facilitated the transition from a wartime situation to a situation of occupation. It's very interesting that there was widespread hunger at the end of the Philippine-American War in many parts of the Philippines, and the only source of food that was made available to the people were from the American garrisons. And also medicine. So when the cholera came, the American medical personnel then came into action. And that's another story. It helps to explain why we still have in mind the image of the Americans bringing health and sanitation and building toilets. Actually, the context of that was the cholera epidemic. But they had to improve the sanitation in order to prevent the cholera, first of all, from affecting the American troops. Protect American troops first, and then think about the people, the townspeople second. But also it was in the context of fighting the cholera that the Americans managed to get the cooperation of many of the ilustrados and educated Filipinos, especially the medical practitioners who cooperated because you had to save lives. And so we cooperated with the American medical personnel. But there were clashes when it came to the ways and means to prevent the cholera from spreading, because under the Spanish occupation, they had already they had medical personnel, and they knew what to do when cholera struck. But the Americans had different ideas. The Americans were more concerned with finding drugs that they could use to kill the germs. So the Filipinos were actually used as guinea pigs for certain medications. Among them was sulfuric acid, very effective for car batteries. But once you start drinking sulfuric acid, then you're dead. But anyway, there are many stories about experimentations with certain concoctions, chemicals at the hospitals in Manila by Americans seeking to find the magic bullet that would kill the cholera germ. Anyway, that's another part of it. So, now, let's go to the part 2, memory, history, politics, which may seem like a very different approach to history, which it is. So the first part is mostly narrative. I'm following, in a sense, Teodoro Agoncillo's style of writing history. He spends the first part of his books reconstructing narratives, and then the second part, he then engages in interpretation, reflection, analysis. In some ways, this is like that. The first part shows that I have a traditional narrative base. I've done my homework, because some historians, they engage in so many interpretations, but they haven't done any original work with documents, which I think is necessary. No, I don't think it's necessary. I'm sure it's necessary. Otherwise, why call yourself a historian if all you do is interpret other people's history books? But some people made a career out of that. I think it's important to stress the fact that there are a lot of primary documents on the Philippines lying out there. We just need people to get to them and process them properly and derive from them new ways of understanding our past, and even resurrecting new heroes. We keep on repeating the same old, we keep on recirculating the same old characters, and actually there are a lot more that we can retrieve from the archives. Anyway, this is the story of my father and me, because we belong to very different generations, obviously. He was born in 1920 and I was born in 1946. But why did I put this in this part of the book? Well, because I discovered in the archives that my grandfather, his father, was actually part of the resistance against the Americans. He was a spy for General Torres's army in Central Luzon, helping General Torres, Isidoro Torres, to keep track of American troop movements. And this is in the archives. But then when I brought it up to my father, when I showed it to my father, he didn't know about it. He had never been told by his father that his father had been involved in the war against Americans. And there are many other instances where I have actually shown people evidence that their grandfather or their father was involved in fighting the Americans, but they had never heard of it. A good example is the story of my late Filipino wife's grandfather, Pedro Carandang, who was the first mayor of Tanawan, Batangas during the American regime, and he's famous in the town for being the first mayor, and there's a portrait of him in the town hall, Mayor Carandang, but they didn't know that after a few months of being mayor, he was thrown into jail because he was playing Amigo warfare. And he languished in jail until the end of the Philippine-American War. That wasn't part of the story of the career of the first mayor of Tanawan, Pedro Carandang. So now they know. There's one side of the narrative was taken out, was forgotten. And I even interviewed the wife of the Pedro Carandang, who was the cousin of one of the second in command of General Malvar. His name was Colonel Gonzalez. And she told me that she remembers dancing with the American commanding officer at the baile, at the dance. So she was there when the Americans occupied Palawan in 1900. But she couldn't remember anything about her husband's involvement against the Americans, and she couldn't remember anything about what her cousin, Capitan Culas or Nicolas Gonzalez, the former mayor of Tanawan, who was the commander of the Tanawan forces against the Americans, fighting the Americans. She couldn't provide me with any information about him, even though he was a cousin. But she did tell me how the American commanding officer was such a gracious person to dance with her. So a very positive image of the American occupation, but forgetting that her own husband had been in the Calabozo. So that kind of selective memory has always intrigued me. And also when you interview people, it's always the Japanese are the cruel, barbaric people, and the Americans, either if they're not nice people who came and helped us, they are not mentioned as barbaric or cruel. So this account it plays around the difference between my father's view of history and my view of history, which took on a different coloring when I went to the U.S. in 1967 and in 1969 I became involved in the anti-war movement, and that's where I learned also my history of modern China and all about Mao Zedong. I didn't learn about that in the movement here, but it was my American professor who was a sympathizer of the Chinese Revolution that taught me about the significance of 1949 and the victory of Mao's forces over Chiang Kai-shek and all that. An American professor, but he had lived in China for a long time. By the way, even though he was sympathetic to Mao's revolution, he was the head of the history department at Cornell at one point. Now you can never have a person like that being the head of it, being the chairman of the history department if you are sympathetic to China, because times have changed. And even then, Professor Biggerstaff, I tell his story in that chapter, was interrogated by the committee, by an American committee of un-American activities. I forgot the name of it, Senator McCarthy. Yeah. Professor Biggerstaff had to face McCarthy and to insist that he didn't think that the American position with regards to Mao Zedong was correct. But he still became the head of the history department. I'm just trying to think about, is it possible now in the US for that kind of a person to exist and still be the head of the history department? It's hard to imagine. So, I don't want to go. I think most people who buy a copy of my book actually read this chapter. Maybe that's also what you have read, because it has pictures. But, the chapter ends with a photo of my father addressing the Scout Ranger Regiment, the first graduating class. And I think he had just been promoted to major, because just before he addressed the class, the Scout Rangers under his command had captured Cappadocia, one of the Hope leaders. And on the basis of that, my father was promoted by Magsaysay on the spot. Major, one of the youngest majors. Now his rise, his career rose very quickly as a result of the victories of the Scout Rangers. I have this, in the book there is a kind of subtle discourse about scouts. You know, there's a picture of me actually as a Boy Scout. When I was a kid in the Ateneo. But that is the extent to which I became a scout. My father is actually known today as the father of the Scout Rangers. And I show how the Scout Rangers in the 50s were doing the job that the Philippine Scouts were doing in 1901. And that the Cazadores, the Spanish Scouts, were doing in 1896. So there's kind of irony there about the Scout Rangers actually doing what the colonial or the imperial Scout Rangers had done to Filipinos in previous decades. There are a lot of ironical things that I bring out in the book, because that's what I found. That's what is exciting about Philippine history. That ironies. I don't know if I don't know how to express my I feel about that, but sometimes people cannot live with it. But I think we have to live with it. It's part of how big Filipino to live with ironies in our history, in our character, maybe until the day when we are able to find ourselves fully. Anyway, and then the other picture is of myself as an assistant professor at UP Diliman. 10 years later, after my going to Cornell, I ended up in the Philippines. This picture of me visiting China with my colleagues. And I remember my father saying, my father was a bit shocked, because for him China was the land of the enemy, the red Chinese, commies. And there I was with my colleagues, smiling with my Chinese colleagues. Well, there's one picture that was not in the book, because I didn't actually have a copy of it at that time, and I can't even insert it. It's a picture of my father in the plane that crash landed in the field somewhere in Missouri. My father is known as a great general, and he fought against the Japanese and also against the communists and all that. But I think that the one time that he nearly lost his life was in the United States, when his plane crash landed, and people mistook him for a Japanese spy. But managed to fly his plane all the way into the into the middle of the United States. And so they were approaching him, and they had pitchforks, and they were going to hang him, because they thought he was a Japanese, and he looks Japanese actually, in a way. And if you look at this picture, you would think that, that it really was an amazing feat on the part of the Japanese to penetrate American airspace. Anyway, I am not making up the story. This story was actually reported in the West Point magazine. One of its cadets nearly lost his life because he crash landed in the middle of the field, and they thought he was a Japanese, but because he was smooth talking, he was able to talk himself out of it. And he already had a good grasp of English. My father was able to speak with an American accent. Amazing. But before going to the United States, he didn't speak English. He spoke Tagalog. And so in chapter 7, I talk about the implications of remembering and forgetting. And it's this issue that I brought up earlier about why we remember the war with Japan and why we don't remember too much the war with the United States, why we regard Japan as the epitome of Japanese soldiers as the archetypal bad guys, the torturers and that, while American soldiers are the ones who hydro, it's always positive. And I talk about Malvar, and I try to give a different spin on Laurel's Republic, on the Republic of 1943, and I show that the independence ceremonies of 1943 actually are worth reinvestigating because there's a very emotional event. I think it was even more emotional than the 1946 Independence Day event, because this was a time of occupation by the Japanese, and there you had General Aguinaldo, General Ricarte, a lot of these Filipino revolutionary and Philippine-American War veterans. They were there in 1943, and they raised the Philippine flag, and there was Laurel, who spoke in Tagalog, not English. Why was Laurel willing to cooperate with the Japanese and to push through with this independence ceremony? Because Laurel and the whole family actually have never forgotten the role of their family in the Philippine-American War. They lost a few of their ancestors in fighting the Americans. And the same with Claro Recto. Claro Recto remembered the time when he was only 11 years old or something, when he remembered his mother being interrogated by American soldiers who were looking for the whereabouts of Colonel Mayo. Claro Mayo Recto is the nephew of Norberto Mayo, one of the officers of the Yalung resistance army. So the memory of the Philippine-American War never left Laurel and Recto. That's why they were actually, and that's one of the reasons I think that they were willing to use the Japanese to pursue the unfinished revolution. Okay. And then I have here another awit, an awit of the war with Japan. I discovered this awit. It's a little book by somebody named Facundo, who nobody has heard of. Actually, it's well written. It's a whole book on Philippine history, and I discovered it in a used bookshop somewhere in Megamo. And when I was looking at it, I said, "Oh my God, this is." It was written. It was published in 1946, and it gave an account of the Japanese occupation set within the context of Philippine history, and also included the Philippine-American War. And I found that this awit actually conforms to some of the rules of awit literature but at the same time, it provides an alternative view of history. To me, actually, it's a more balanced view of history than what we read in the textbooks. Because, for example, it talks in a very positive way about the Japanese, what the Japanese were offering to the Filipinos and about the Laurel government. But then, when it came to 1944, it talks about the Japanese terror. You see, you don't view the whole Japanese occupation as a single event. Within the Japanese occupation, there are divisions, and it's really 1944. And when did the massacre of the brothers take place? 45. You have to view the Japanese atrocities as taking place mainly towards the end, when the Americans were coming. And also, the way that Facundo talks about the Filipinos as being like Bernardo Carpio, in between two clashing rocks, the two colliding rocks, the Americans and the Japanese. How relevant that is for today, actually. Okay, so that's a kind of interpretation of the Japanese occupation in the light of the dynamics of remembering and forgetting. There's one picture I didn't put in that. It is my grandmother's. This is the younger sister of my grandfather, Lola Asho. And she told me that only recently, when I interviewed her before she died, that she almost got married to a Japanese officer in 1950. They had met during the occupation and fell in love. She went to Japan, but then decided later on not to go ahead with it because it was going to be too difficult to adjust to living with a Japanese family, and moreover, she was taking care of the children of my aunt. Her niece, whose father was killed by the Japanese. So she was taking care of her two nephews, whose father was killed by the Japanese secret police. But at the same time, she fell in love with a Japanese officer and always married him. So again, ironies, things that make it very difficult to come up with a very black and white picture of who is friend and who is the enemy. So here, chapter 8, the return of Andres Bonifacio, very quickly because it was already mentioned earlier. The publication of the book by Agoncillo is very much, how should I put it? I'm losing my energy, so I'm going to try to go through this very quickly now. Just read the chapter. Because this is the first time that a Filipino president was identified with Bonifacio, Magsaysay. It was Laurel who proclaimed Magsaysay to be the Bonifacio of the times. And after that, it was Erap. And has there been another one? Maybe not. But this is also connected to my thematic of of the Philippine-American War, remembering, forgetting. It's a bit too much for me to explain it now. But I have a photo here I want to share with you. I've never shown it in public, it's not been published. Here's a photo of that event right after the time, right after Magsaysay was proclaimed as the new Bonifacio by Laurel. Here's Laurel here. And that's my grandfather, Enrique, who was Laurel's classmate at UP College of Law, and very close. Although my grandfather, who was the congressman of Tondo, Manila, for 2 terms, was not good enough to beat Arsenio Lacson for mayor, and that was the end of his career. He stopped trying after that because he had used up all of his wife's money, my grandmother's money. Anyway, this is Magsaysay, and that's Laurel. And I figured that this was the time when Laurel facilitated the the transfer of Magsaysay from the liberals to the nationalistas and proclaimed Magsaysay as the new Bonifacio of the times. And chapter 9, History was Rizal in 1956. Let me just make a very brief statement of what it's all about. There was an attempt to make the Japanese occupation, to turn the Japanese occupation as the dark age of Philippine history, and the martyrs that would facilitate liberation would be Filipino and American soldiers who fought side by side. And the aim, there was, if you read the debates surrounding the Rizal bill about whether Filipino students should be made to read the novels and all that, and the resistance to the church, there's a lot that you can learn about conflicting interpretations of Philippine history. And one of the things that struck me was the attempt by some of our politicians to make the Filipino-Japanese resistance to the Filipino-American resistance to the Japanese as the foundational event of Philippine history. They were saying that let's forget about Rizal, Bonifacio, that's not relevant anymore. Our textbook should begin with the Filipino-American War against Japan, and the victory, the liberation of the Philippines by MacArthur. While Laurel, Recto, all the proponents of the Rizal bill were insisting that no, we should stick to the Philippine Revolution against Spain as the foundational event. That's why we need to still read Rizal's work and all that. If you put yourself in 1946, you all learned English in school, and Americans are liberators, you're very close, we are little brown brothers. We can forget about Spain, we can forget about the Philippine Revolution. Let's just focus on our glorious war against Japan, where we won. Of course, that side didn't win, and it would have been difficult for them to pull that off. But just to let you know that we could have had textbooks that began our history with, or the history of the Filipino Republic anyway, with the 1946 Republic. Finally, the third part, very briefly. This chapter has to do with early American writings and how basically our view of our forgetting of the Philippine-American War starts with the way that the war was portrayed by early American writers, and how their portrayal of that event entered into our earlier textbooks, the textbooks written by Burroughs and Atkinson and others, which were in a way Filipinized by the students of Burroughs, like Benitez and all that. But basically the message therein was that the Philippine-American War was just a big misunderstanding. It didn't need to happen. If only Filipinos understood what the Americans were bringing, there was no need for them to resist. A great misunderstanding. That is one chapter of Burroughs' book, The Great Misunderstanding. And also, the books, the early American writings started to talk about the caciques, the rural despots. The reason why the Filipino-American War wouldn't end so quickly is because those local despots, those mayors and all that, they were playing games. They were playing amigo warfare. They were resisting us secretly while, on the face of it, pretending to be loyal to us. So the mayors then began to be treated in a very negative light. And the negative treatment of the local municipal elites has carried over into some present day writings. like Ben Anderson's work and Abinades's book on state and society, they carry on the early American interpretations of the local elites as the partners in crime of the bad friars, creating a dysfunctional society. That's the reason why the Philippines could not properly become democratized under American rule, because of the legacy of Spanish colonial rule, which then came to be cast in the kind of in the dark light. You know, it's a dark age of late Spanish rule. This is one of the big tasks of our historians now, is to reevaluate the way that American rule, Spanish rule, Japanese occupation, all that have been interpreted for us and passed on to students in our textbooks. So in this, so I tackled the issue of cacique democracy. I disagree with Ben Anderson's use of cacique. It's a complex term which has many different meanings. You have to know Spanish history as well, especially 19th century Spanish history. And you have to know how the Ilustrados understood the word cacique. And you have to get over the American interpretation of the late Spanish rule as a dark age. And also, but of course by this time nobody thinks that the Philippine-American War was a great misunderstanding. If there's anyone here who wants to defend that position, please try to. But my father would have thought that. My father would have thought it was a great misunderstanding. Because having gone to West Point and he lived in a, his America was all very positive. While my America, when I was there in the late 60s and early 70s, was something I didn't attach myself to. I couldn't identify with it. I saw all the negative things that my father did not see about the system over there. And I also use contemporary terms like humanitarian dimensions of a war on terror. I'm talking about the Philippine-American War and how the Philippine-American War was written up by an American historian named Gates, who used the word war on terror. The war on the Filipino cacique-led resistance to the Americans was a war on terror. It was used, that term was already used by the 1960s. And also the humanitarian dimension of the American involvement in the war was brought up. Okay, this is chapter 11, is a critique of American scholarly writings. This is where I get into trouble because I take on the works of McCoy, May, Lande, Steinberg, Owen. Those are all of them I know personally, but I can see their point, but I can also see that their works, in a very subtle way, almost unconsciously, they reproduce American colonial discourse. And I make the argument that because they grew up in the American educational system and they see the world through American eyes, then they also view those events in an American way, which is not what they want us to think. Glenn May, for example, thinks that he is a scientific historian and he's beyond those kinds of biases, while we Filipinos, because we are nationalists and because we are too emotional in our response to what happened in history, we don't detach ourselves. Well, they can. No, I'm saying that they are also as attached. I mean, I'm saying that if they can look at us in a certain way, we can look at them in a certain way as also being biased in their own way. And this is my critique. It came out originally as Orientalism and the Study of Political Politics. I actually gave that as a talk at the University of Hawaii in 1999, and it was published In 1997, it was published in 1999. It's a critique of American scholarship on the Philippines and how it also affects their view of Philippine politics. And that was the beginning of the downslide in my career. They made it difficult for me, I must say. And I'm actually writing my memoirs on how, on the risks of historians, the risks that historians take if they tell things as they see it. And some people do not tell things as they see it. They alter it because they have to survive. They have to live. They have to keep their tenure. They have to get promoted. They have to sell their books. So if my book has not been reviewed by an American journal since it came out, it's very understandable. And I have proof actually from concrete proof that some American scholars have decided not to deal with the book because it is a bit too much for them. But not all. There are also some American scholars who approve of what I've been doing. So I'm not talking in terms of categorical differences between an American view and a Philippine view. No, it also depends on certain schools of history, certain individuals, the differences and all that. But I do insist that an American scholar writing about the Philippines also carries with him or her a cultural perception of the other, the Filipino other, that has been transmitted by decades of American education about their Filipino wards. But they don't, and I have to say it now, they resist having Filipinos tell them that they are just like us. They always, I found it very, very consistent in my dealings with American scholars, and I've been dealing with them for a long time, that they somehow still feel that they're special, that we're still caught up in certain cultural, the damaged culture thing. It's too simplified. Anyway, leaders, Anarchy of Families refers to Alma Coy's collection, Anarchy of Families. Leaders, factions, and parties, that's Harlande, patron clients, puppets, those are American writings that I am critiquing in that chapter. And finally, chapter 12, the boss mayor and his critics is a critique of Ben Anderson's Cacique Democracy and Seidel's boss system in the Philippines. And then I return to Yalung in the last sections, and in my critique of Anderson and Seidel, I refer to my research on Yalung, the Philippine-American War. So I connect with the first part of the book, where I talk about Yalung, because it's useless, it's pointless to critique them if you do not have counterexamples, if you have not done research to show that they are not quite right. You have to, because I was criticized in the past when I did my initial criticism of their work and say, oh, what's the alternative? Can you show us the data that shows that we were wrong? Well, I'm trying, by putting the first part there on Western Quezon of Tayabas province as a case study, I'm saying, well, I have done my homework. I have found some concrete examples to show that your paradigm is faulty. And I end up with a discussion of what Rizal thought about caciques. He did write about them in the novel. So that's it, that's the book. And the last page of the book makes a reference on the contemporary Supreme Cacique, Duterte, because when I was finishing the book, and it actually helped me to finish the book and to publish it, I felt a certain resonance of the past and the present. Mayor, Philippine-American War, talking about, you know what he said about history. And I thought it was appropriate for me to bring in a contemporary example of what some would portray as a supreme cacique. By the way, Marcos was called the Supreme Pacific by Anderson, and Quezon was called the Supreme Pacific in his time. So, yeah. And there's an appendix, Artemio Ricartes sa mga kabataang Filipino. It's a long appendix, and I did not provide a translation. Maybe I should have. But it was originally published in Spanish and Tagalog. No English version. This is the speech he gave when he returned in 1942. It's sa mga kabataang Pilipino, and what he's saying is that, why have you forgotten the war which I fought, and your forefathers fought back in 1900? Why have you forgotten that? Don't you know that? Then it talks about all the atrocities committed by the Americans back then. And then he says, how come you see history through the framework of American history? You know more about America than you know about what they did to us. So Ricardo was already saying in 1942 when he returned, he already saw that the American educational system had done its work. And so Filipinos were fighting to the death, side by side with the Americans fight against the Japanese. And that was the reason why it became such a tragic event in our history. But there's an irony there. It's not to say that we shouldn't commemorate the dead, the martyrs of Salle and all that. That they really deserve to be. But at the same time, if you look at it in a wider context, we can, begin to think about why it had to happen and whether it could have happened some other way, and what we can do to prevent it from happening again. We can learn from it without necessarily doing away with our commemoration of the war dead and all that. So that's my book. If there are any questions, I hope I have done justice to it in this extemporaneous talk. Thank you.
Okay, so students, do you have questions regarding the book? Otherwise, any reactions or comments, jointers, confusions, or anything you would like to clarify regarding the book?
Siguro, I would just like to thank Dr. Ileto because our conversations and the talks that we gave, and my field trip was cancelled. It was supposed to be yesterday. So I was so happy to complete all your lectures. In many ways, I became your student. And in this series of lectures and conversations with you, I believe that my view of Philippine history in many ways had, shall we say, expanded in such a way. It's different to read the book and to talk to you. And na-illuminate lang sa akin na, it's really the elite, the class divide that Salle Salazar first started to talk about, the damuhan ng pagkakaking pangkalinahan, is very, of course, it's when you talk to the public and to people and as a teaching tool, it's very useful to talk about it. But as scholars, and maybe we should also try to make people see that this is very complicated. And anyway, Salazar did not say that when you're elite, you're bad, and when you're massa, you're good. Except that when people listen to and read his writings, they felt like that. So when you're talking about, caciques and, local ilustrados and all of that, it basically enhances our perception of the past. That, not all of them are bad. I also was able to examine, because I have to make a mea culpa here, that I was one of those who promoted General Luna and Goyo. We went around the country. Okay? But I'm also telling people in these talks that you should never see these protagonists as real protagonists. In those talks, I was clarifying that, if you're going to look at Paterno and Buen Camino, for example, as total traitors, people will, it is because you have thought that the movie portrayed Luna as a perfect person, which he was not. I mean, the movie was clear that he was killed because he was an asshole. And the movie was actually depicting that people have certain interests that we might not understand because we're looking at it black and white. For example, Paterno. But if you're looking at his argument about, let us have peace because we might not win this war, let's talk to the Americans, is someone that an academic might, think about if he was given the same situation. So, the certain writings, your talks clarify that we should put into context these personages more so. And that you've given us, of course, in your books, fresh people to look at. The way you did in Passion when you were talking about Puling and Sakay, and at that time, these people were in the fringes of history. Of course, now it's different. I mean, you don't look at Puling and Sakay as people in the fringes of history now because they're being discussed a lot in the schools. So thank you for
Yeah, thanks, John. I just want to mention with regards to this tendency to view Filipinos or the events in history in terms of class differences or struggles. I remember seeing a couple of American reports as they were about to invade, for example, an area where the guerrillas were fighting. They would justify it in terms of, we are going to free the Tao from the tyrannical hold that their cacique leaders have over them. And who are they referring to? Who are these tyrannical leaders? Malvar, Mayo, Masangkay. They are interpreting this resistance movement in terms of they are emphasizing the difference between the leaders and the followers and trying to portray them as in terms of an image of feudalism where the Americans have to come to liberate what they call the Tao from the rapacious leaders. Now, if you put yourself on the other side, what did they think of these rapacious leaders? Then you come up with a very different picture. How did Mayo and Malvar and all those people, how did they look to them? We're talking about the peasant farmers and people from below. How did they view their leaders? So instead of automatically assuming that because they are below, they play the role of the oppressed in the feudal society. It's a cop-out, for historians because they don't have to do any more work. They don't have to try to find out what they were really thinking, people from below. So I'm trying to understand how they view the big men in society, because ultimately I view the Philippine society in terms of Southeast Asian history. It's part of the Malay world. In other parts of Southeast Asia, if you view a Datu or a Raja or whatever, you try to understand the relationship between the leader and the follower. But when it comes to the Philippines, automatically we assume that it's no longer part of the Malay world, and that you have, like Latin American caciques and their poor native oppressed followers. No, the Philippines is not. There's no racial divide anyway between leaders and followers. Masangkay was an Indian. He may have been a landowner and he may have been an ex-mayor, but in terms of color of skin, it was no different. Why did people look up to him? Why did he become a successful leader in the resistance against the Americans? Well, I have a very touching quotation from him when he was asked to give testimony at the end of the war as to why his secretary, because all of these Indio mayors who did not speak Spanish well, they always had an ilustrado with them, or a rural ilustrado who could read and write Spanish perfectly. The secretary of Masangkay said that I tried to make my colonel surrender, but he said he wants to remain in the field until he dies or is captured because he took an oath to defend the mother country. So, this shows you that this Indio mayor, you might want to picture him as a local tyrant, strongman, as a rapacious feudal leader, but he was one of the last to surrender because he had taken the oath to defend his mother country. Shouldn't we take that seriously? Or should we just dismiss it as, that's sinasabi lang niya yun, because he wants to have a good image of himself in history. But that was his secretary saying that. I tried to make him surrender, but you know what I mean? But history from below, when I used it with Passion, was misconstrued as history of just the people from below. But what I really want to do is try to understand anyone above, below, whatever, in terms of what is in his or her mind, and in terms of the context in which he said things or did things. Maybe history from below is not the right term. Maybe I just want to get around the tendency of us to put people into neat boxes, pigeonholes, categories. Oh yeah, you're there. I want to let them speak as much as I can, but of course we are prevented from doing that by all kinds of problems, the sources and all that, but we should try our best to understand people in their own context. So tama ka, I mean, you've seen that's my approach to history. Not necessarily just trying to articulate what the masses were thinking, but that's the most difficult thing because they didn't leave written letters or sources behind. But I also want to understand what those mayors were thinking when they were running the towns in partnership with the Friday. How did they do it?
I will not elaborate here, sir, but in my column today, in the Manila Times, I was able to, I was so surprised that when you said before, and this is what I thought, that you wanted to write different things. So you didn't stop writing about Passion, and you wrote another book, and then you wrote another book. You didn't want to do the same thing. But I was also surprised that this recent weeks that I was able to realize the connections of the three books that you have. It's like when you continuously read it, it's actually a sweep of Philippine history, which is quite different from what we usually read about. So thank you so much for that.
Maybe I should have the second one reprinted, Philippines in the Revolution. Maybe it can be sold as a set.
Yes. Thanks.
Marketing.
Something
Then you can write some blurb about what you saw. You saw this as really one complete series or something, continuous series. Yeah. They were written about 20 years apart, actually. 1979, 1998, and 2017. 1999. Any other questions, please?
Any other questions? Okay, reaction.
Questions?
Reaction?
Reactions?
Disagreement? Or you just want me to talk more about myself? Okay lang? Yes.
Well, I have always wondered why we do not celebrate the First Republic as a national holiday, although we recognize Enrique as the first president. So why do you think we don't do that?
Ah, I see. Don't we?
No, we only celebrate it
Local.
local, very local.
You mean the Malolos Republic?
Yes, January 23.
It's not a national holiday, but then we recognize
Yes,
Enrique as the president.
Well, because when the First Republic was proclaimed, we were already almost at war with the Americans, right? So it's a victim of forgetting. It's a victim of the history wars or the American educational system. I think that the division in our study and understanding of the revolution between the war against Spain, leading to the proclamation of independence, and the Philippine-American War, that's an artificial division. I think that when we talk about the Philippine Revolution, we should talk about 1896 to 1902, or even 1930. It's a continuous event. But under American colonial education, they cut it because they wanted to make the second part a great misunderstanding.
Exactly.
And if we commemorate the First Republic in the same way as we do the 1946 one, we are kind of we're making a statement that American colonial tutelage wasn't necessary. We already had everything we needed to form our functioning republic. We didn't need the Americans to teach us how to do it, but that's the way that they justified their occupation, and that's why they had to portray the Spanish period as in the worst possible light to justify their taking over.
But now, even in the celebration of the centennial of the revolution, it stops exactly there. It's a language.
Oh, really? Oh.
No, neither Ramos nor Estrada wanted
I know. When you look at I remember the Grand Centennial Parade in 1998. So, there was one event that was.
only there. They had a.
Philippine-American War was not portrayed very.
Until someone reached, they had like a close about that. That's it.
There was no battle between Filipinos and Americans in the Grand Centennial Parade.
No, may I brag?
Yeah.
I convinced President Estrada to hold his inauguration in Palasor Church.
Ay, ikaw ba yun? Oh. Oh, I see.
So he said, bakit ko na yan? Diba? Kaya na siya sabi ko, sa hapon na kayo pumunta sa Amerika.
Really?
I said, pero dapat dyan para mag-continue with you. So, he understood. So,
Sister, nagkaroon lang ng distinction ngayon. Never hold your inauguration in Parasoy. You will never finish your term.
If you think that Enrique was lamenting the fact that the Filipinos had forgotten the resolution in 1946, when in 1907, Felipe Calderon was lamenting the fact that the young generation had forgotten the revolution. That was only 1907, because he read in a newspaper that those who took the medical board exam couldn't answer the questions about history. They all failed, especially those who studied in private schools. That's why he wrote his Revolution Filipina, because
Calderon.
yeah, he wrote that because he was so devastated that the younger generation, after a few years, had already forgotten.
But he was referring to the revolution against Spain, right?
Yes.
Not even about the Philippine-American War.
That was only 1907.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So if that was the case, then what I was saying earlier about the possibility that that the revolution against Spain might actually be deleted from our textbook history and then substituted with the revolution against Japan, Philippine-American resistance to Japan, that actually makes sense. That could have happened. Yes.
Last week ko po ito gusto itanong sa inyo. Nung nag-present po kayo, parang sinabi nyo, nagsimula kayo na MA, ang gusto niyo po isulat ay about sa history na Indonesia at nag-aral pa po kayo ng batch para maintindihan ng kasaysayan nila. Sa kasalukuyan po, kilala kayo bilang tagapagtaguyod ng kasaysayan ng Pilipinas at binigyan niyo po ng isa kayo sa parang nagsimula kung paano tingnan ng kasaysayan. Paano yung bagong pagtingin sa kasaysayan. So yung tanong ko po, bakit niyo po naunang isipin na isulat yung o pag-aralan yung kasaysayan ng Indonesia bago yung Philippines?
See. Yeah, that was in when I applied to do my PhD. I was given a scholarship to do history, Southeast Asian history. Kasi nga, it was Southeast Asian history, so I had the opportunity to study other countries in the region. So, ang pinili ko Indonesia kasi alam ko na kung marunong Tagalog, then it's easy to learn Bahasa Indonesia, which is true. You can learn it in one semester. So I think the Southeast Asia research, or the Southeast Asia program should have Bahasa Indonesia already. Meron ba?
That's what they will offer.
Oh, I see.
They're talking about it now because the students really want them.
They want it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
They know that it's actually easy.
we had a meeting already, the dean, and Hassan will be offered.
Yeah, I think it's a good initial language to offer. Kasi if you offer Burmese or Thai, they will find it very difficult to learn Thai because you have to learn a different script. But Bahasa Indonesia, I compiled the common words in 2 languages. I'm already 1,500 common words between at least Tagalog and Bahasa. But the same thing also with Spanish, by the way. Spanish and Tagalog are also very, and the Philippine languages I borrowed a lot from Spain. Anyway, to go back to your sinasabi mo, I also did not understand being a product of the Ateneo history. I didn't understand the historical debates that were taking place. I knew zero about Agoncillo. That's why I keep on telling people when my professor, an Englishman, told me not to write like Agoncillo, when I first visited his office in September 1967, he told me straight away, you're not going to write like, do not write like Agoncillo. And ang reaction ko, sino ba si Agoncillo? Because I only knew De La Costa and Zaide, of course. So if I had known that Philippine history is filled with so many interesting things to rediscover and discover, I probably would have done Philippine history as well. So once I learned about Agoncillo and also I discovered that, like my father, I didn't really take seriously the Philippine-American War. But when I rediscovered it during the Vietnam War period as an anti-war activist, and having read things that argue that the Philippines was actually the first Vietnam, then I could see how, doing Philippine history would be the way to go. But initially I studied Maguindanao because my professors said that, since you already studied Indonesia, and you know also about Philippine history, you do something in between, which is Mindanao, which was neither part of the Spanish nor the Dutch imperial or colonial state. This is my last session here. I'm leaving this afternoon, so you might as well ask me now.
Sir, question na po. Last week binanggit niyo po na the end of American century in the Philippines is already inside or almost there. Do you think with the end of the American century, lalo na yung pagdating ng mga Chinese, lalo na yung lumalakas ng Chinese influence sa Pilipinas, will the Duterte administration will take this opportunity to try to go back through Philippine history where the Americans were portrayed as the war bombers, traitors, or even committing horrible atrocities, just like what President Duterte binigay niya ng pictures si President Obama na massacre ng Budbagsak po. Will it be at the same time na magkakaroon ulit ng konting pagtingin or at the same time paghanap ng mga sources na related sa mga American atrocities when hindi lang sa Philippine-American War pero throughout our Philippine history? Will it be the time na may mag-challenge talaga na maraming Filipino historians na will pit themselves against the American?
No, actually, there's no need. We have had enough writings about that since the beginning of the last century. It's not as if the American textbooks were the only ones that were available, because the memory of the Philippine-American War continued to be produced in different forms. And during the Japanese occupation, I found out that because the Japanese, of course, it was in their interest to make Filipinos try to remember the Philippine-American War, and many came out, sharing their stories about the Philippine-American War. That was the golden age of the historiography of the Philippine-American War during the Japanese occupation. What I'm saying is that today, we don't even have to do additional research, although of course a lot more can be found. It's just that we have not taken, we are so taken up by the shared history that I mentioned earlier of common struggle between the common history shared by Filipinos and the Americans fighting for freedom against Spain and Japan. I think that the Philippine-American War will be more prominent in our memories when we think about a special relationship. It will help us to understand that the Americans are just like any other colonial power. There's no need to treat them as special. There's no need to go and have a special relationship with any others anyway. If we are truly an independent nation state, then we just think about ourselves and make friends with anyone and everyone who can be of help. So, ang problema kasi ngayon, lumalabas is either America or China. It's not the case. It's actually being independent, as we have always claimed to be, but never actually practice it because the Americans put in place a knowledge-power nexus that made us more inclined to accept their view of the world and to identify with that rather than to think for ourselves. But what I'm saying is not, it's been said by many others, many other public intellectual scholars. I just added some more ammunition for those who would like to pursue a more independent policy. And as I said, the American century is not coming to an end. It has come to an end. And they are just trying to use every trick in the book to remain the hegemonic power, but it's not going to last. Unless, of course, every one of us gets killed in a nuclear war or in a pandemic of coronavirus. We need to be prepared for a new world order in which we are one among many, and the Americans are one among many countries that we can relate to and not a special friend. That is a problem. I've been criticized a lot for my views, because in fact somebody said that I'm biting the hand that feeds me, by criticizing American scholars. Somebody has to do it. spoken to a lot of academics who agree with me, but they will not say openly because it will hurt their careers. I won't name names.
Sir, kadalasan ng mga historiador ay nagsusulat din sila ng theoretic, yung balangkas ng kabuuan ng kasaysayan. Pero sa cases ng mga libro ninyo, hindi masyadong napupusan yung buong history ng kasaysayan.
Yeah.
The other historians wrote about it, yung iba yung naglalabas mismo ng mga books in terms of yung balangkas mismo ng kasaysayan. Pero is there such a time, sir, sa inyong career na bumuo kayo ng isang buong balangkas ng kasaysayan ng Pilipinas?
Yes, yeah. That is my actually one of my next projects to write a new kind of history of the Philippines. And I have actually provided some hints about the structure in my lecture to the Arts Congress here a week ago, but I don't think people were listening to me carefully. But that is the outline of the new book. So you have to view Philippine history without the Spanish period being seen as a dark age. If I were to try to identify what is the cradle of our civilization, it's not our pre-colonial past, it's not our American past, it's the Spanish colonial period. That's what made us what we are to a great extent. But it's difficult for us to revisit that past because we no longer learn Spanish. We all speak in English, of course, and of course our national language. But it's important because the more you dig deeper into our national character, the way we do things, it reflects how we developed during those centuries under Spain. And the Americans, of course, added their own ingredient to this mix. But when I do my history of the Philippines, I cannot go back to the beginning of Spanish rule because that's not within my research. But the 19th century, I know very well. So I will start with the 19th century and end with the present. I'm just trying to find out, there's one problem that I have to solve, and that is, who is my audience? Because I'm being asked to write Philippine history by foreign press, university press. But I tell them that if I'm going to write a history for you, it has to be also for Filipino leaders, and they say cannot be, and I agree with that. So, we just give it up and write a history for here and publish it here. Kalimutan mo na yung foreign publisher. Yeah.
Just, I think 2 days ago, Professor Root, Dr. Root of the Social Weather Stations,
Yeah.
published a book for Oxford. It's a series. It's part of a series. It's the Philippines, what everyone needs to know.
Yeah.
And I was only browsing about the history, and of course I can now see your dilemma, because when you were looking at if you want to write for foreign audience, you would really lessen explaining things in the local context, because you have to. So it was devoid of talking about ginhawa and all those other concepts, no? Kalayaan, it's devoid of that. But what is interesting, you might be interested in it, is although I haven't really read it, he had a critique of Ben Anderson's Cacique. Cacique. He was saying that Anderson was not correct in using that term Cacique and putting it in general terms to politics. So I'll leave it if I mean.
Road has has read my work.
Definitely.
Yeah. About my critique of Ben Anderson. Actually, my critique of Anderson goes back to when it was first published. I already reacted to it. But it took some time before I could put it into words, my feeling that there was something wrong. It's not his fault, actually. It's not Ben Anderson's fault. He was a very bright scholar and very open-minded. Kaya lang, he did not give to the Philippine studies what he gave to Indonesia studies. He spent many years becoming Javanese, learning Javanese and Bahasa and going native, so to speak, learning the culture, immersing himself, and then he wrote about Indonesian politics. In the Philippines kasi, he took shortcuts. He actually just adopted Al McCoy's template for understanding Philippine history. It's the American colonial, it's what I'm critiquing. I'm not critiquing Ben Anderson, I'm just more or less saying that, that he adopted the American colonial viewpoint, but gave it academic respectability, which is why I had to critique it, because I looked around in the internet, look at all the courses in the world on Philippine politics. First reading, Cacique Democracy in the Philippines. So, and actually, Cacique Democracy in the Philippines is a history of the Philippines, all compressed into one article. And so, people studying Philippine politics will have a historical background like that. I mean, is that what, I mean, my feeling was, am I going to let it just happen, or should I not mount a critique of it? But my views were confirmed when I had a Spanish student. I advised a Spanish student to do her PhD with me at NUS from 2003 to 2007. And she was from Barcelona, Catalan. And she was the one who confirmed that Anderson's views are faulty, based on the knowledge of the Cacique phenomenon in Spain, the debates about Caciquism in Spain itself. So,
Gloria,
kilala niyo ba si Gloria?
nabasa mo.
Huh? Her PhD thesis can be downloaded actually from NUS. It's very long. It has not been published because she was afraid of the blowback, because she is very critical of American writings. And in fact, she has no job now. And sometimes I feel that maybe I had something to do with her predicament. Right? Kasi nga, when she came to be my student, she was just going to do a conventional history of the Ilocos in the 19th century, socioeconomic history. And I put her into, I made her aware of the problem of how the early American writers rewrote the history of late Spanish period in order to suit American imperial objectives. And once she got into that, there was no stopping her. She saw the problem and developed it into a PhD thesis, which has not been published, although she has published her critique of Blair Robertson, her critique of some American writings, but it didn't, it's very difficult for her to become a conventional academic because of her views were rather too radical, in a sense. Okay, any other?
Mr. Avalos, do you have any questions? Mr. Tayag, do you have any reactions?
Sagot lang po ako, regarding po yung sa notion of progress ignorantes. Ang tanong ko lang po kung paano po nabuo yung ganun notion na kung saan iba yung pagtingin ng Ilustrado, pagtingin sa masa na pobre, ignorante, walang alam. Paano pa na po yung ganun pong notion po? Kasi when yung binabasa ko yung passion last TikTok OJ, parang nagtataka paano nabuo yung notion na iba yung pagtingin ng Ilustrado sa masa, paano po ganun po yung pagtingin ko nila?
Because this comes from my interpretation of Agoncillo's Revolt of the Masses, because that is where it all started. When I read this book, I was inspired to write about the Revolt of the Masses, following Agoncillo. Kaya lang, ang napansin ko the way he talks about the masses is that their worldview was not any different from the worldview of Ilustrados. Enlightenment, influence, anti-clerical, ganun ba? So I looked into, and I noticed that the Ilustrados, when they wrote about the participation of ordinary people in the revolution, and they found out that they were expecting darating na si Bernardo Carpio, Haring Bernardo Carpio, or yung tutulungan tayo ng Siete Pares sa Francia. All the characters in Awit ni Corrido were being imagined as coming to help the Filipinos in the war against Spain. That's recorded, and then the ones writing that were saying, ito mga pobres ignorantes, look at the way they think. They don't understand that the war against Spain is not, it has nothing to do with those Awit and Corrido. They don't understand result writing. That is where it comes from, result writings. But then it appears that, the people, many people who joined the revolution were interpreting it in a different way, which was described as, pag-iisip ng mga pobres ignorantes. So every time I come across a dismissal of someone as, sira ulo yan, or pobres ignorantes, then that makes me interested. What is it about? What are they thinking that makes people think that they are crazy? Or in the case of, or even in the case of our Supreme Cacique today, the things that were being said about him makes me even more curious about what people really think about him and how do they view him. I've always been very sensitive to name calling and yung labeling. Kasi even in my case, when people label me as, anak ko Gemma, or born in the silver spoon, I'm sure that Gemma would have experienced a little bit of that also. People think that because of your name or your class origins, that your thinking follows a certain way. I've always resisted that. I always try to understand people in their own terms, instead of saying because it comes from a certain class. This goes against classic Marxist thinking, but I'm more of a phenomenologist in that sense. That I'm more interested in describing, bringing out certain categories of experience, perceptions. And so when I saw references to pobres y ignorantes, that is when I started to think, what is it that those pobres y ignorantes were really thinking? Can we historians articulate it? But then, of course, I have also been criticized. Ileto thinks that he can articulate the thinking of the masses. Who is he? He's just an Ilustrado. Well, I also say that we can never, in fact, reproduce another person's thinking, but we can try. We can make an attempt and at least be humble enough to say that this is as far as we can go. But the past is the past. The past can never be recovered fully. It's already happened, and all we have are the traces of the past, and we try to reconstruct, and we have to have a good imagination. in reconstructing the past, but we must always understand that it will always escape our full grasp. We can never know it fully.
Okay. So, if there are no more questions, I think we can do what we got. Yeah.
Well, actually, this is a fitting end, to the visiting professorship of eminent historian in Southeast Asia, Dr. Reynaldo Ileto. As he mentioned a while ago, he will be checking out from WH staff residences and spend more or less a week for a short vacation with his family, and we'll be back to Canberra. Hopefully, we'll be able to invite him once again in the near future. And by that time, hopefully again, he'll be done with his new book. And hopefully, we can launch it here at the Salle University. I would just like to really thank Dr. Ileto on behalf of the DLSU Department of History, the College of Liberal Arts and Administrators of the university. We're truly honored that you accepted our invitation to be here for 3 weeks. And I'm sure that with the lectures that you have imparted to our students and guests, I'm sure that they were inspired somehow. Yesterday, we had a very interesting talk. Dr. Ileto talked about his friends, the Southeast Asian scholars that he has worked with. So hopefully again in the future, when we get to invite him once again, we'll be able to do more lectures, on a varied topics. And so with that, this is, we've prepared something for Dr. Ileto. So Dr. Hernandez, we're taking this opportunity from your class. Dr. Ubaldo will be talking about what it consists of.
Kunting aklat po na nasa wikang Pilipino. Ang katipunan na aklat na ito ay tungkol kay Hermano Puli at sa Tayabas. Ang larangan na inyong sinasaliksik. May isang artikulo po ako dito na na-inspire, na naging inspirasyon yung inyong Passion and Revolution. Pinag-aralan yung kasaysayan ni Hermano Puli na sinulat ni Gabriel Beato Francisco na lulus sa tuhod naman ng ating guest na si So, yung iba pong mga artikulo ay laging mayroong pagtutukoy doon sa inyo mga tungkol sa kay Puli, sa Tayabas, at sa Timog Katagalugan. So, maraming salamat po sa Ileto. Tanggapin niyo po ang mga aklat na ito mula sa Tayabas.
Big E.
Oh. Salamat po. Papa Panboy.
Ito po. Tapusin na natin. So, thank you po.
So maraming salamat po sa dalawa sa kurso natin.
So, pipila na po yung mga gusto magpapirma. Guess po natin. Sir? Mga fanboy. Mga fanboy. Mga fanboy.
Sabihin mo, flex mo si Ileto.
Ayaw na natin.
Kaya hindi siya pinag-transcribe. Pero hindi flex. So, yun ang sa'yo. 140. Is 45. That's what someone natin. 45. Is 45. 40 to 45. Lima tayo Hindi ko galing na siya.
Say % na lima dito.